Hi, everybody. Welcome to A Mighty Blaze, where we are obviously already having too much fun. I am Jenna Blum, one of the co-founders of The Blaze, here with my sister co-founder, Caroline Levitt, and our special guest, Joanna Rakoff. Welcome, you guys. I'm so happy to see you.
Joanna. I'm so excited to be here.
Yay! Oh my gosh, this is like such a happy-making occasion. So if you are not new to The Blaze, thank you for following us and for attending our Friday Frontliner this week. And if you are new to The Blaze, I just want you to know a couple of things. We are 35 volunteer creatives dedicated to connecting writers and readers in the age of COVID and beyond. If you like what you see here today, please give us a like or a follow on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, on YouTube. We are ubiquitous. We're even on TikTok. And please consider subscribing to our newsletter at www.amightyblaze.com so you will never have literary FOMO ever again. No mo FOMO. Nobody likes literary FOMO. Very dangerous condition. So I'm going to introduce Caroline with her bona fides, and then I'm going to introduce Joanna, and then I'm going to let everybody talk, and I'm just going to sit here and fangirl. Caroline, you ready for your intro? Buckle up. Caroline, in addition to being the co-founder of The Blaze, is the New York Times best-selling author of 12 novels, including Pictures of You, Is This Tomorrow, Cruel Beautiful World, and her latest, With or Without You, which is out in paperback June 29th, right?
Yes.
Yes. Yay! I'm so excited. We're going to carry her around on our shoulders here at The Blaze, so definitely put that on your calendars, please. With or Without You is the best book of everything, according to Pop Sugar, People, Bustle, Lit Hub, Publishers Weekly, and it was a Good Morning America pick. Caroline is also the book critic for People and the San Francisco Chronicle. So if you are writers, you should be kissing her bleep. And she is a New York Foundation of Arts Fellow. Her essays have appeared in New York Magazine, New York Times, Modern Love, Salon, The Millions, Lit Hub, and more. And she just had this most fantastic piece on grief out with Zibby Owens' Moms Don't Have Time To. So if you guys have not read that yet and you're grieving, because who is not grieving something in this weird age, right? You should definitely check Caroline out on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all the other places, and read this essay. It will reduce you to a pile of rubble and rebuild you. Joanna Rakoff, who lives across the river from me in Cambridge, and I'm in Boston, and I love her so much, and I see her like only in places like Missouri and online, so we have to fix that. Hi. Joanna is the author of the international best-selling memoir, My Salinger Year, which I have in hardcover and paperback, and the novel A Fortunate Age, which is the winner of the Goldberg Prize for Fiction, the Elle Readers Prize, and a San Francisco Chronicle bestseller. Joanna's books have been translated into 20 languages and nominated for major prizes in the Netherlands and France. And you have written for the New York Times, Vogue, Marie Claire, Oh, the Oprah Magazine, and many other publications. So My Salinger Year, as we all know, was made into a movie called My Salinger Year, which is clever how they did that, which stars Margaret, is it Qualley or Qualley? Qualley, who we were just saying in the green room, is like, she looks tiny, but she's really like 6 feet tall, but I knew she weighed like 90 pounds as Joanna, and Sigourney Weaver as Joanna's boss. And I have to say, like last night, I watched this for the second time, and it was so meta because like I love Joanna and I love the book and I love the movie, and here she is on The Blaze. And so I feel like we have this sort of tripled Joanna, like not even squared, but like tripled and exponentialized Joanna goodness. And we're going to talk today about My Salinger Year and about book to film. The movie opened in theaters and it's streaming now on Vudu and Amazon and like everywhere fine movies are seen, basically, right? I watched it myself on Amazon Prime. Oops, I said Amazon on The Blaze. That was bad. And it opens in the UK on May 17th of this year. And as Caroline said in all caps, it is freaking fantastic. It really is. I have so many questions for you, Joanna, but I'm going to turn the mic over to Caroline for a little bit and let her.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay, so, you know, both the book and the movie really sort of did me in, because it seems to me like the central question is, when do you stop doing other jobs, like fallback jobs, to do the thing that you really love to do? That's a big question. And I know that for many, many years, I had a lot of time-sucking jobs, because I had it in my head that I had to have $500,000 in the bank before I could quit and really be a writer. And when I finally left to be a writer, I kept thinking, why didn't I do this earlier? What's the matter with me? So it seems like that was one of the messages in the book and in the movie that was done so beautifully, when you finally reaches the point where you say, you know what? I'm stepping away from this. And it was done so brilliantly because you had a real choice. You could have veered into being an agent at a top agency, and instead you walked away. And I find that the best of all messages, because if you have something to fall back on, you usually do, and you don't find the guts and the courage to do what you need to do. So what I wanted to ask you was how much harder was it really for you than as shown in the movie? And what did happen immediately after you walked away from that job?
That is such a good question that no one has asked me in the
Oh,
million
really? Oh,
I've done. It's funny. I'm a person who I sort of fear change, and I sometimes have a lot of trouble making decisions. I'm sure no one can relate to this at all. And but what often happens with me is things are kind of brewing in the back of my head in a kind of subconscious way, and I'm not even aware of the fact that they're brewing there. And then suddenly some really dramatic realization comes to me. And that's kind of how it was in life. Like um, in real life, and I think in the film and in the book, these two things were kind of tied together. I had this job and I had this kind of terrible boyfriend. And
yes.
I felt kind of beholden to both of them. I liked the job way more than the boyfriend, but they both provided me with things that I kind of wanted, kind of like an entree into a literary world. They both were parts of very, very different literary worlds, but they sort of each gave me a taste of the literary universe. And I think, what happened was that really at the exact same moment, I realized, okay, I've sort of reached, to use this super cheesy term, I've kind of reached the tipping point. Like, I don't need to stay with this boyfriend anymore. I'm done with him. I can't stand it anymore. And as happens in the book and in the film, there's this whole sort of just awful, honestly, thing where he keeps the date of his best friend's wedding from me. And I had been hearing about the planning of the wedding, and then but I didn't know exactly when it was, and then basically explains that he wants to go without me. And in real life, I was devastated. I don't think you see in the film how devastated I was, but I was so upset. But then he left, and all I felt was this incredible relief. And so this was Labor Day weekend of 1996. And that same weekend, I was sort of like the junior most person in this office. And everyone had left to go to the Hamptons, really the Hamptons, that's where they all were. But I still had to go in and do my job the Friday of Labor Day weekend. So my boyfriend left that morning, and I went into work, and I was by myself in the office. And I think that's when, I started to realize what I want is to be sitting by myself writing. I don't enjoy being in this office surrounded by other people. I can't do this for the rest of my life. I'm not built for this. And so being in this office, which looked like a library, I sort of did a little work, and then I mainly wrote poetry at the time. I was I would sit at my desk and write poems and then send them off to literary magazines. And so I did that. And then eventually, I was such a rule following person that like, it was a half day, and I was like, okay, now the half day is over and I can go home. And it was so pleasurable to be by myself, in all ways. Like, yep. I left the office and it was 400 degrees, as it often is in New York in August. And I was so happy. I was so happy to sort of have this freedom, to have this afternoon to sort of do whatever I wanted, to go home and read, to go home and write. And that's really when I think some part of my brain was like, you're going to leave this job. But in real life, it was difficult. It was difficult to tell both boss and boyfriend, which I did basically in the same week, that I was done with them. And they were both upset. My boss understood, but was still upset. She truly thought that I was going to stay on and become an agent there and kind of, inherit her role, I think.
Wow.
And my boyfriend really kind of thought that we were going to get married and that, I was going to support him for the rest of his life while he wrote unreadable, like impenetrable fiction, and with like an S&M sort of element to it. But what happened to me afterwards is that I sort of took a little time off or break. I went to visit my best friend from college who was living excitingly in Miami. So it was January in New York, and my best friend she's a curator of contemporary art. So she was working at the art museum there. And so I went and visited her. I can't even remember if I had a return ticket. I just kind of went there and stayed with her and spent, weeks just kind of like trailing her to art openings and meeting artists and trying to figure out what I was going to do. And then when I came back to New York, there's an agent in the book. He's called Max. In the film, he's called Max too, and he's played by Yannick Truesdale, also known as Michelle from the Gilmore Girls, which was very exciting to me. And so that agent in real life is an agent, I can say this, whose name is Henry Dunow, who was quite a big deal agent at the time. And I was his reader. And I basically went and talked to him. And so he had just left the agency to form his own agency. I went and talked to him, and he said, like, you can do whatever you want. I can set you up with interviews. And he actually set me up with an interview with this very famous editor named Faith Sale at Putnam.
Oh, I know Faith Sale.
Yes,
Wow.
Legendary editor. And she offered me a job as her assistant. And I turned it down because
it would have been the same thing.
Yes, exactly. And
it would have been the same thing.
Interestingly, she was very angry, and Henry was angry at me too. And what I ended up doing was taking a job for another agent who worked out of her home and basically said to me, you can have flexible hours. You don't have to work full time. And it would just be me and her. And her client list was, mostly like nonfiction. It wasn't like super up my alley, but the situation was. And so I did that for a year or so. And then I went and got my MFA at Columbia.
That's incredible. That's incredible. So do you think that having this kind of bravery do you still feel that now? Like if there's something that you want to do that you're gearing up to be brave enough to do? If it's too personal, you don't have to ask, but of course I want to know.
I think so. I mean, I think that, this is like the stupidest example ever. I can't even believe I'm going to tell you this. And then I'll tell you a not stupid example. But so I'm part of a writers group that's all people who are trying to finish books during the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And so we meet on Zoom and we're all over the country. And we also have a text thread, and people will sometimes kind of like freak out on it. Usually me. And I feel I shouldn't be so self-deprecating. Me as much as anyone else. Anyway, one person was talking about like how because of the pandemic, she has kids, one of whom is pretty little, and she only has one day a week to herself, like one day where she has the full day. And yet she can't sit down and start writing ever. Like she always has to, like her house is always insane, and she has to like spend a bunch of time cleaning it up and like just doing all this sort of, and she was like, please tell me not to clean my house. And I feel like, okay, the reason I'm mentioning this is because there's this kind of conventional wisdom that I think comes from like Annie Lamott, that's like, where she says something like, it used to be that I couldn't write if there were dishes in the sink, but now I could write if there were a dead body in the sink. And I remember Amy Bloom telling me this once, like, let your house go to hell. And basically the reason I mention all this is not because I feel like people should let their house go to hell. I don't feel that, but because I feel like in the world, there's so much conventional wisdom about how to live your life. And none of it ever applies to you. Like, maybe you are a person who could write with a dead body in the sink, but my friend, who's a great writer, is not. Like, she has to clean up her house. And like, if she takes 3 hours to do that on the one day she has to herself, then great. And I don't know why I'm getting so fired up about this, but I guess I feel like maybe, you know, I'm always sort of, I think in my head, what has to happen for me to be brave is to kind of let go of those voices. Like, I'm from a very, very, very conservative, conventional family. And, you know, there's always that voice of society, which is a little bit like my mother being like, you know, this is the acceptable way for a young lady to dress. Like, there's always that voice. And I always have to kind of somehow, and again, it's like an unconscious thing. Like, I have to kind of shove it aside. But the really good, you know, like, I can think of a few good juicy versions. And one of them is that I was married to someone who was really the wrong person for me. And it was a very unhappy marriage. And we got married very young. And it was the kind of marriage, you know, where we didn't talk to each other at all. Like, I kept myself completely separate from him. And I mean, starting from the day after we were married, I thought, this is a huge mistake. Why did I do this? This is,
wow.
I mean, literally the day after, I was, you know, sobbing to myself. I won't tell you the specifics. I mean, I don't know who else you would. I was alone and sobbing. So I guess that's sobbing to yourself. And within a few weeks, I remember I called my mother and said, you know, I made a huge mistake. I shouldn't have done this. And she said to me, well, you made your bed and now you have to lie in it. So
oh God, that's terrible advice.
And so I told myself that for years. And I think, you know, I don't know. It's almost as if I were like living in a previous century. You know, I was like, no one in my family gets divorced. I'm not going to be a person who gets divorced. And then like something kind of snapped in me. And then the other component of this story is that in both the book and the movie, there's a character known as my college boyfriend. In the movie, he's called Carl and played by an extremely handsome actor named Hamza Haq. And in real life, his name is Kirill. And he was my college boyfriend. We dated after college, and I kind of left him, not really knowing why. And as the years went by, you know, we stayed in touch. He was still my best friend. And as the years went by, I started to figure out why I had left him. I started to understand this. But really, like, not a day went by when I didn't miss him. And, you know, I eventually, like, there's so much more to the story, but eventually I ran into him. So we were not out of touch, but I ran into him unexpectedly, actually, in Boston when AWP was here. And he hugged me and I said, how are you? And he said, I'm not good. And I said, you're not? Because he's actually like a very famous composer, and he's like the head of a department at MIT, and his life seems really good. And he travels all over the world, and he's like a Guggenheim fellow and whatever. And so I said, you're not? And he said, no, you know, I can live without you, but I can't be happy without you.
Oh.
And in that moment, I realized, wait, that's what's true for me. So I can live like I'm this productive, like successful person who, you know, ostensibly has a good life, but I'm not happy without him. And so in that moment, I was like, okay, I'm leaving my marriage. And so, yeah. So I guess the thing is like that it took me, I don't know, 15 years to figure that out.
But it's so brave. It's so brave. Jenna, you ask the next question.
Oh, God, thank you. I'm just sitting here feeling kind of awed by this whole thing. So, and I kind of knew this story. And Joanna, I will admit that Joanna and I met at this fantastic writing festival called the Unbound Book Festival in Missouri that Alex George, who also runs the Skylark Bookshop, runs. And so she told me some of the story on a bus, I think, or like in an Uber when we were going from the festival to the airport. We did this sort of like a girl bonding thing. And I've been a Joanna fan like before and during and after. But last night, after I rewatched my Salinger Year, I was like, wait a minute. So Carl in the movie is actually your husband, who I saw on Facebook. And I'm a little ashamed, but not really, to say that I did a deep dive into Joanna's like past interviews. Because I was like, didn't she tell me this on the bus that like she and Carol got back together? So I love that this is like an inspiration story and a love story. One of my questions is, I have many questions, and I was thinking while you're talking about being an unhappily married 20-something or an unhappily relationship 20-something in New York. Like there were so many of us, and I wish we had all known each other at that time, like you and me and Kate Christensen and Caroline. Like we were all sort of rebounding like molecules off each other while we were seeking our sense of purpose as writers. And I loved this. Do you feel that you have found a sort of a balance now with that personal happiness, like successful life plus happiness? Are you still striving to find your writer self? Like I know it's a constant balance for you with your beautiful children, who everybody can see on Facebook, by the way, your children and being a mom and a wife, and also like having this fierce identity. Are you finding the balance? Like, how does that work?
That's such a good question. I feel like I've been struggling recently, especially during the pandemic. I somehow so I had Kirill and I have a child together, who is 5, Izzy, and I would say like in the year or two, year and a half after she was born, things were sort of okay, and I wrote a lot. I wrote the proposal for my new book, and then which meant like writing a huge chunk of the book. It's a memoir, and I have a new novel that is in the works, and I wrote a whole bunch of that. And then I'm actually realizing that this can't all be attributed to family. Then what actually happened is that around the time that I sold that memoir, when Izzy was, it's sort of a toddler, I was also hired to write the screenplay for my Salinger Year. And that kind of took over my life. So I think that what I've been really struggling with is finding a balance, not necessarily as like a wife and mother and writer, though I am, but more sort of like just a balance as a person who has too much going on, kind of, and maybe needs like an assistant or something, I like somehow it's a little bit like when that third child became older, she has a really strong personality, as might be evident from social media, and is really different than my other 2 kids. And the weird irony is that Kirill is like a very kind of quiet, reserved person, and I'm like a pretty like easygoing person, like but Izzy is like a force of nature who, like, if we leave her alone for a second, will like destroy our house. And you'll be like, wait, was your house burglarized? No, our 5-year-old just was left alone for 1 minute. And so it has definitely, she takes up a lot of space, kind of. And also, this is the last thing I'll say, but I think, there's so much that has been written about being like a new mother and writing, or like having little kids and writing. I feel like somehow like writers often feel shocked by the transition to motherhood. And so they write a lot about it. And there are so many examples of it, I don't know, that I can't even name. There are a million essays out there and books too. But what's been interesting for me is like when my older kids were little, I would wake up at 4 or 5 in the morning. I would write until they got up. I would bring them to school. I would go write for the day. I would pick them up, get them to bed. Then I would write more. And, but now that my kids are like essentially teenagers, I actually feel like it's harder to just be like, I'm off, because especially during the pandemic where in which they're so lonely, and they're kind of like grown-ups now, and they have really complex ideas and problems. And I also feel really lucky that they want to spend time with me. So
that's really lucky.
I feel like, what am I doing? Like, and so anyway, I guess really what I'm saying is that life feels really complicated right now. And it sometimes is hard to kind of clear away all that complicatedness and focus. But the final thing I'll say is just that, like that same friend who was like saying that she shouldn't be cleaning her house, also likes to say, who's a novelist named Miranda Beverly Whittemore, who's a great writer. She, and is very wise, like she likes to say, the only way out is through. And I realized that, when I do sort of put everything aside, like, all of this the film really did take over my life for a few years, like film stuff, publicity stuff, like businessy stuff. I'm sure you guys understand this. And just sort of like work, that's when I feel most like myself. Like when I think about the happiest moments of my life, I sometimes think about, like, I hope this isn't depressing, but like when I was on deadline for my Salinger Year, I just basically worked, 12, 14 hours a day for a few weeks. And like I got extra childcare. And I sometimes just think about those long days of writing and just how happy I was.
Yeah.
And so I don't know, complicated answer to this question.
No, I think that has to do with the personality of a writer. I mean, we're all introverts. My feeling about the pandemic ending sometimes is, oh no, I'm going to have to go out in the world and socialize when I really like just being at home in my office working. So there's that.
Yeah.
Jenny, you had another question.
I did. I just had a quick follow-up about that. Thank you, Caroline. I was wondering, because you are balancing so many things as we are you willing to hire an assistant? Like you mentioned that back in there somewhere, right? Like I think about this a lot. People tell me you need an assistant. You have like 4 careers, which is true. And I would love to hire an assistant because I think it gives me back the quiet space that I can then go to, like the hour in my day where I might just look like I'm drinking a cup of coffee, but I'm really germinating something.
Exactly.
And not just catching up on freaking laundry when I'm not doing anything else, right? Like, do you feel that, do you do something like that?
Yes. And so a few years ago, I was on tour just endlessly for my Salinger Year. Like I toured the world and I had these jaunts, I spent almost a month in Australia. I spent I think 3 weeks in India. And so there were all of these complicated tours. Some of them, and I know you guys both know this, but like, it's supposed to be really glamorous to go on tour. And there are aspects of it there really are. But then some tours are just very grueling. Like I had a whole tour of Germany where I was in a different city every single day. So every single day I was taking a train, I was flying, and I don't speak German and I'm Jewish, and like sometimes felt weird being on these trains with like dogs sniffing people. And I was like, what is happening? Anyway, so point is that at a certain point in the touring, I started to be like, I have totally lost control of my life. Like things were truly out of control. I couldn't even I was like forgetting to pay bills. I was, all of the kids stuff, like signing the kids up for things and just the stuff that you have to do, like filling out permission slips, all of it. It doesn't all fall to me. Kirill does tons of it, but I just couldn't manage it. And also just on the business side of things, like there's so much coordinating, like endless people being like, and I need your photo and bio and blah, 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 blah. And like, and so I had publishers doing this, but it still felt like so much. And so I posted about this on Facebook, just saying I'm so overwhelmed. And all these people, I'll mention a few of their names because people out there will know who they are. Like the big person who comes to mind is Taffy Burdesser-Ackner, who's an old friend who was like, you have to hire an assistant. And I was like, what? Like, this was insane to me. And she was like, my assistant right now is booking a blowout and also booking like my next interview. And I was like, what?
Wow.
And a bunch of people said this. And one person said, I actually have someone for you who's a former student of mine, and she's incredible. And so I did hire a part-time assistant, and it was great. Like she took over all of this kind of administrative stuff.
Oh, that would be wonderful. That would be wonderful.
So I've thought about doing it. And I will tell you one other like tiny story, which is that I have a friend who I think qualifies as like an influencer, which is unusual. And we met because she was writing a memoir, and she basically wrote to me for advice. This is before she was an influencer. She was just like a person then, and she's sort of become one. And she used to run her own. So she's a former competitive figure skater, and she used to run her own coaching business. And that involved a million moving parts. And very long story, very short. She like had an agent who was shopping her book around, and things weren't going exactly how she wanted. So this person was like, basically was like, I'm going to just set up my own small press and basically self-publish my book because I know how to do publicity. I know how to do everything. And I have a million followers or whatever on all these platforms, so I can get people to buy my book. So just last week, she was explaining that she hired an assistant to just like, do graphics for her for Instagram and just like do all this kind of administrative stuff. And she was like, this has been amazing for me. So I guess the final thing I'll say is that another good friend of mine who actually teaches meditation said to me a couple of weeks ago, Michael Jordan doesn't mow his own lawn. Like,
that's right.
And I was actually saying to her how overwhelmed I was. And she was like, is there anything that you can just like have someone else do for you?
Right.
And when she put it that way, I was like, oh, right. Okay. So it seems like, I don't know, maybe people do have to hire people so that they can be freed up to just, that's part of the problem is that it's like with my friend Miranda, like, being like, I have to clean the house first. That's how I often feel. And I think everyone feels that way. Like you have this day, but you need the time to just kind of like let your mind wander. But often you don't have that time. And the thing that we haven't talked about is, of course, something that is a huge thing in the film and the book, which is that social media technology is just like ever present. And, that I think kind of impedes our ability to kind of just let our minds wander. So anyway.
I have a two-pronged question, and then we'll go back to Jenna. I loved A Fortunate Age. I actually had you on my blog for that book because I loved it so much. It's about a group of people, young people coming of age in New York City during a very particular time. So I know you've said it was not autobiographical, but you were a young person in New York. So did writing that book jumpstart you to have the courage to go deeper and do first person in My Salinger Year?
No. So
no? Really?
So A Fortunate Age, I wrote, I feel embarrassed talking about it now, but I started writing that novel. I had been writing another novel set in Algeria that was like your classic kind of like overly ambitious 24-year-old person, sort of like, I have to write a big ambitious book sort of book. And A Fortunate Age was actually like me cheating on that book because that book was so not fun to write. And everyone kept telling me not to write it and saying like, oh, who cares about people in New York? There's so many books like this. And but the way I saw that book was that I wanted to write a kind of like grand, epic novel about middle class people struggling to kind of like a grand novel about small things, kind of like the Forsyte Saga, or certain Edith Wharton novels. I really had the Forsyte Saga in mind. So, and that's really how I thought of myself. I thought of myself as this writer of big novels, like big social novels. And I was working on another one very slowly. I did the classic kind of like first pancake thing. Like I had a novel that was similar to the Algerian novel that had like Holocaust stuff in it and all sorts of like big mysteries, and it just wasn't working. And I realized that it was like partially my response to some of the criticism of A Fortunate Age, and I wanted to write this like big political novel. But then I started working on another novel that was actually working. And I basically the idea for my Salinger Year was presented to me by an editor. And I actually said no many times. I kept saying no. And then eventually this editor talked to my agent, and my agent said, you know, I think he's right. I think you should do it. And I was like, what? Because she had been telling me not to do it. She basically, I hope this is okay to say, but she was like, you don't want to be like Joyce Maynard. You don't want to be known as like the Salinger girl. Like you don't, if you do this, you're going to be known as the Salinger girl for the rest of your life. And then the agent, the editor talked to my agent, and he convinced her. I still said no. And I didn't want to write in the first person. I had written personal essays, but I just wasn't really interested in writing memoir. I didn't love to read memoir. Now I do, but I didn't then. I wrote a lot of criticism, as you guys know, and sometimes an editor would send me a memoir that was supposed to be novelistic, and I would hate it and be like, I shouldn't review this. I'm not the audience for this. I don't like this. And, but basically my agent finally said to me, why don't you just sit down and try to write a few pages of it and see how you feel? And so I did. I took a week and I wrote what ended up being the first 20 to 25 pages of the book, and was like, okay, wait, there is a story here. I think that I can write this and have it feel like a novel. So I thought of it kind of like almost like an exercise for myself. And I really thought of it, this is one of those funny things. I wonder if you guys have ever had this. I thought of this as like a throwaway project. I was like, no one is going to read this.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I was just like, you know, my next novel is going to take, like, I'm a slow writer. My next novel is going to take me 5 or 6 years. I can write this book in a year or two. This is just like a little thing. And I was not prepared for the response to it. So, yeah. So I thought of this as almost like the opposite of A Fortunate Age. My agent kept saying to me, just think of it as writing an extended essay. It was not like that at all. But that's fine.
Do you think, I have many follow-up questions to that, but as somebody who takes 5 to 6 to 10 years to write a novel, and they're all big, ambitious, 400-page, blah, 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 with so much research that sucks up my whole life for like 8 years and whatever. And I just wrote a memoir in 7 months. And it's like, boop, and it's coming out in October. I feel like it was freeing in that sense. And it did feel like a throwaway project, honestly. It was like a containable situation in my life, like a year, right? It was like a year in my life that was about something very specific. It had a beginning, a middle, and end. It was contained in that time period. And that taught me something and was a pivot point in my life. I highly recommend this for all frustrated novelists out there. Like, just write something that's a throwaway, because it sort of takes on its own life. So I have a question about this, which is, do you feel as though you might be ebbing toward another memoir project or a novel project. But I also wanted to ask about the movie based on the book. Again, like I love this book. I have it in hardcover. That's how much I love it. And I wore this shirt because in the movie, the color palette is all this like incredibly nostalgic, like sort of 90s/70s autumnal colors, right? Like Joanna is wearing, like I'm wearing, like Caroline is wearing. And the whole movie has this great, tender and almost painful throat aching nostalgia to it that to me was about being young and made me think, thank God I'm not in my 20s anymore. And at the same time made me think, I wish I had that like supple young 20 something body back, and like that, you know, that 20 something like hideously painful consciousness that your life could go in any direction and not really knowing like which choice to make. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm trying to wrap this in one question when really I have like 50 questions in one question. But like, did writing that memoir like make you want to write more memoirs about this sort of like throat aching potential of youth? And is that what you thought of when you looked at the movie? Like, is that what the movie became for you? Was it about that one encapsulated period?
So right now, the book that I'm working on now that I'm under contract to write and very behind on is another memoir. And in some ways it is about youth. It's partially about my sister's youth. I have a sister who is almost 20 years older than I am. And it's sort of, a lot of it takes place when I'm a little kid, like 3, 4, and she's a young adult. And all sorts of just actually very tragic stuff happens to her, and my kind of trying to unfurl that. I guess what I would say is that I do right now feel a little more interested in writing about slightly more adult problem, literal clothing that I wore. And I still had some of it, and was able to show it to the costume designer. It was amazing. And I was like, I miss wearing those embroidered blouses, and I miss my green coat and I miss my combat boots, and it's like, can I still wear stuff? And I did actually like recently buy a lot of new clothing that maybe is too young for me, that like just was more fun than my normal clothing. But I did feel this kind of like a wave of longing for that moment of sort of extraordinary potential when the world feels so exciting and like anything can happen. And, you can go to a party where a New Yorker editor is going to say, let me look at your work. And, but I will not, I fear saying this because I don't want to sound negative at all, but there are parts of me that watching it definitely brought up an enormous amount of feelings for me. And there were parts of me that thought, oh God, I was presented with so many opportunities that I was too naive even to see as opportunities. And also so many opportunities that I was too sort of, I don't know, insecure to take. A lot of it was honestly just like not even realizing that like when the New Yorker editor says like, hey, do you want to come by and have lunch? He really meant it. Like, and, not realizing what doors were opening for me and that I should go through them. And I wish it made me feel like, oh, I wish I could have a little bit of a do-over. Like, I wish that I could be 24 again and take these opportunities, rather than kind of hide from some of them. And sort of think like, oh, why are all these things happening for other people? Because looking back on it, they could have happened for me. I just was too kind of nervous and dumb,
That's you.
Yeah, it's true. You see these people though, like, I don't even know who, like, I don't know, like someone, let's just say like Nell Freudenberger, who like, gets an internship at the New Yorker and like shows the editor a story she wrote, and then it's published, and then suddenly she's like 24 or whatever. And like, and I feel like why is she able to do that? Or like, why is Jonathan Safran Foer able to write a whole novel as an undergrad and show it to his professor? Like, I would have never in a million years been able to do anything like that. Like, I think I'm a little bit of a late bloomer. So watching the film made me feel like, oh, I wish I could just do it all again, you know, and it also filled me with like little pangs of just like, I don't know, like just little bits of regret about all sorts of other things. I definitely felt regret about the person who's known as Jenny, you know, who was my best friend from high school and who I loved so much and is so wonderful. And our friendship really did fall apart. Like all of that really did happen, you know, and I feel like, why was I so kind of judgmental of her and, you know, for moving to Staten Island and like, why?
Well, Staten Island.
I mean, she moved to Cleveland. That's not Staten Island, but like, sorry, Cleveland people. You know, I think it's a very pangy movie. Like, I'm glad you felt that way too, Joanna, because I watched it and I felt so pangy for my 20-something self. Again, simultaneously thinking, thank God I'm not that young person anymore. And also thinking like, oh, you know, if I could go back to that time, what would I do? And I'm surprised that you felt you were a late bloomer because I thought your character was so brave. Like when your horrible boyfriend, who was wonderfully, deliciously horrible in this very specific, like faux literary way, you know, when he turns out to be a dick and goes to a wedding without you, and you're like, I'm just going to spend the weekend doing my own thing. I thought I would never have been brave enough to do that. I would have been like on the train stalking him at the wedding. And, you know, so I felt like I hid in my young marriage and didn't become the writer I wanted to be. And I thought, how did Joanna get to be so brave that she just went and worked in this agency? Like, I thought that was an act of total bravery. So I know we have audience questions as well. And I'm wondering if we can throw the ball. Oh, okay, here's one. What is the most surprising or interesting thing about seeing your life on a screen?
Oh, God. I suppose, honestly, the most surprising thing was those pangs, like the sort of really extreme emotional reaction it provoked in me. I mean, the first time I saw the final cut of the film was at the Berlin Film Festival, the Berlinale, last year, 2020. It was the opening night film, and so I saw it in a theater with 1,700 people. I was sitting next to Margaret, and on the other side of me was this wonderful actor who plays Hugh, Brian O'Byrne. He's kind of a well-known stage actor. He's incredible, and I was just crying through the whole thing, even at moments that weren't sad, because I was so overwhelmed with emotion. And when it came out here, I was actually scared to see it because I just knew that now at this point of the pandemic, I feel a little bit like an open wound. Like this has been a really hard year. And I felt like, I don't know if I'm ready to kind of open this all up again. And so I waited. The film opened on a Friday, and it was playing at the theater, you know, the Jenna the Kendall, like, which is not in my neighborhood, but it's really close to me. I'm right by Kirill's office. And I was like, I have to go there. And the theater chain, the Landmark, was like, could you come and take pictures with us? And we'll take pictures of you watching the movie. And I was like, okay. And, but I was scared to go. Exactly. And so I think that was what was so surprising. Like you would think that it would just be like fun, like movie star playing me, but it did, you know, sort of, it was really, really emotional. And it still is. Like I'm writing a piece right now about the making of the movie that I swear is like a month late. And I keep saying I have to rewatch it because it will help me finish this piece that I can't seem to finish, but I can't bring myself to do it because I know that I'm going to be destroyed.
We have another question, Tom. How did your kids react to seeing your life story on screen?
Oh my God. Okay.
I can imagine.
So I took them to see it at the same theater, the Kendall. And it's the first movie that we've seen in a theater in, you know, obviously more than a year. And they, it was really mixed. I mean, they did really like the movie. They're kind of the right age for the movie in a way. But they were so, I'll tell you the funny part is that they were so horrified by the boyfriend character.
Oh, right.
And every time they like kiss or touch each other, they were like, ah! Like they were they were just, ew, gross. And they, they had a lot of questions for me afterward about him. They were really interested in him. And then they, of course, also were really interested in the portrayal of Kirill, who's their stepdad. He's been their stepdad since, 2013. And so they live with him. They know him really well. And they were just like, he would never wear that. He would never wear a t-shirt tucked into jeans with a belt. And like, he would never talk in a hotel lobby. And they were just but they did feel that Margaret Qualley captured some kind of like ineffable me quality sort of, which I thought was really, that made me feel like, okay, yes, she was a great choice.
We have time for one last question from the audience. Is there one memoir that inspired you or that you were especially moved by?
Yes. So when I was, in the year, after I signed the contract for my Salinger Year, I was like, I need to start reading memoir. Like, I don't know if I had read even one memoir that I didn't have to review, And so I basically like made it my job to read memoirs. And so many of them, I'm just going to be honest, like I didn't think were great. Like so many of them, the first chapter was great and you could see that was the proposal but then like the sort of arc of the book was like this rather than like a novel, which is like this. But I found like this kind of these few books that really did feel like novels. And the big one that I'll mention is by Claire Dederer, and it's called Poser, My Life in 25 Yoga Poses, some number of 26 yoga poses, and some number of yoga poses. I've now read it 3 times, and I knew Claire a little bit. We were book critics. We shared the same editor at Newsday. And my editor for years kept saying to me, like, do you know Claire Dederer? Your writing style reminds me of her, and you guys have so the same taste. And we eventually became kind of friendly. And ironically, like I actually do an enormous amount of yoga. I'm a huge yoga person, but I was like, I don't want to, why would Claire write a book about yoga? I don't want to read this book. And then I decided to, and it basically is a memoir that reads like my favorite type of novel. Like it reads like a big Victorian novel. And it's almost kind of like her life story with this kind of structure imposed on it of these yoga poses. And I just love this book so much. I love the voice of it. I love everything about it. It's the memoir that I always return to. So that my Salinger Year, I feel like I should say, is really different than Poser. But that was the book that made me realize what was possible for memoir. It made me realize, okay, a memoir can read like a novel and can have these really developed characters. Like so much memoir that you read is just about the narrator, and everything is so through the lens of the narrator. And as a reader, that's not necessarily what I want. And in Claire's book, there are just all of these kind of very developed characters. And in a way, it's almost like a kind of memoir of observation. It's just all scenes. And anyway, it's so good.
So good. Well, speaking of so good, your book is so good. I have to hold it up again. I found your book really inspiring. I think many of us read memoir to learn about our lives and to have our lives bounced back to us, or like parts and fragments of those lives. This book bounced my 20s back to me, and that sort of at that moment of unfurling and blooming and all the questioning and pain and wonder that involved. So thank you so much for being with us today to talk about the book and about the movie, and especially about the behind the scenes of your life, which I think all of us can relate to so much. We hope you write more memoirs, more novels. Bring it on. Give us more. Like, let somebody else do the laundry and even the yoga, so you can write us some more books.
Oh, thank you guys so much for having me. I love you and admire both of you so much, and this is like one of the most fun things I've got to do. So
I can't do the heart, right?
I know. I'm like, there you go.
I do that.
We're thrilled to have you on. You're welcome to come back anytime you want and talk about anything.
I would love to. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Joanna. Thank you, everybody.